Welcome to MrCScience.com, the video on the 4 criteria of life. As usual, if you have any questions about this video or any other things, drop me an email at mrc@mrcscience.com. So, according to biologists, in order for something to be alive, it must meet 4 criteria. What are those 4 criteria? Let's take a look. The 4 criteria of life reduced to just the absolute basics is number 1, DNA. It has to have DNA. Number 2, eats. Number 3, senses and responds. And number 4, reproduce. Let's talk about each one of these. The first one is DNA. DNA is also known as deoxyribonucleic acid. It's a little double helix information carrying molecules within your cells. We're going to get into DNA very much more close than you have so far. So we're going to do that in Module 7. So looking forward to that later. Let's move on to the second one. Eats. Eats gets a little more involved because all living things eat. They have to bring energy in from the outside and use that energy. The process by which they bring in energy and use it is called metabolism. In your book, it's defined as the sum of all processes in an organism which convert energy and matter from outside sources and use that energy and matter to sustain the organism's life functions. That's metabolism. So basically it takes in energy and uses that energy to sustain itself, to rebuild itself, to power or movement, other things like that. How it does this is broken down further into 2 different processes, anabolism and catabolism. Let's talk about catabolism first. Catabolism is the sum of all total processes in an organism which break down chemicals to produce energy in simple chemical building blocks. So when you eat, you bring in the food. We'll talk later about digestion, fun stuff like that. But when you get to actually respiration, breaking down the food for energy and for building blocks to help build other portions of the cell. Anabolism is the sum of all processes in an organism which use energy in simple chemical building blocks to produce larger chemicals and structures necessary for life. So catabolism breaks the energy down. So grab my pen. Catabolism breaks the energy down. Energy and building blocks. Building blocks are not Legos. We'll get more into what the building blocks really are when we delve in a little bit. So energy and building blocks come from catalysm. They go to anabolism, which uses that to power the cell, to build larger structures and things like that. Sometimes the structures it build will take excess energy and store it in things like fat or starches in plants, things like that. And sometimes then later on, that energy will return to catabolism to break it back down when it needs it. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Something you'll discover as we go through the book is scientists like to label everything, break down everything into little parts and label all the parts. The first major label you'll hit in this area, and we'll use this one quite a bit actually, is autotroph versus heterotroph. An autotroph produces its own food. You probably know from other sciences what's the process that produces its own food. You guessed it, photosynthesis. Photosynthesis are carried out in, oops, lost my pen again. Photosynthesis are carried out in plants. Green plants growing out of the ground. Here, we'll put a little flower on it, although it's all green. And it's the ugliest flower in the world. Okay, so photosynthesis. Autotrophs produce their own food. That means heterotrophs don't. They have to eat stuff that they did not produce. So that's the first major breakdown. Autotroph versus heterotroph. Now, like I said, scientists like to label things. So beyond the autotroph versus heterotroph, they start breaking it down further. They have producer, consumer, and decomposer. You've probably heard this before. This shouldn't be new to you. A producer, guess what? Produces its own food. It is an autotroph. Um, so autotrophs. Oops, lost my pen again. Autotrophs are producers. Everything else, consume or heterotrophs are consumers. Eat basically producers or other consumers, and decomposers. Decomposers eat dead things. So most first thing, producers, consumers, decomposers. Now, an interesting thing about this is the energy flow in the system. Let's talk about that really quick. Okay, so producers, consumers eat producers. So the energy that the producer makes, luckily, when a plant makes its own food, it makes more than it can eat. A lot more, in fact. So that energy goes to consumers. Consumers eat producers. Consumers also eat some of themselves, consumers. And actually, in a way, consumers can also eat decomposers. So consumers eat pretty much everything they can get their hands on. So, but once consumers eat, they don't necessarily finish the meal, or things die of natural causes, other things like that, and are not consumed. They become meals for decomposers. So what's kind of interesting in that is, where do producers get all their energy to pass on to consumers and decomposers? Guess what? They get it from the sun. We'll delve into photosynthesis in more detail, but energy from the sun is captured by the producers. They only use a little bit for themselves. The rest they save for the consumers to eat, or if they die, the decomposers eat it as well. So, and all that energy, and then the decomposers kind of release the energy back into the system. Again, especially nutrients and things will go back through the system to the producer, but we'll get into that more detail further into the book. So guess what? There is another category. This one you're probably familiar with too. Herbivores. Herbivores, these are all consumers. So consumers are all different types. So we got our herbivores. Herbivores eat only plants. Carnivores. Carnivores eat only consumers or meat. Omnivores eat both. Now, what's kind of interesting, your book talks about this, but in reality, scientists have broken it down even further. Let's look at their list. Okay, first of all, I should tell you, these are not in the study guide or on the test. You do not have to remember them. It's just a fun fact. So we got avivores, eat birds. Insectivores eat, guess what? Insects. Bacteriovores, bacteria. Frugivores, fruit. Folivores, leaf-based diet. So foliage is where they get that. Piscivores, I can't even say that. Fish-based diet. There are yet more than this. Let's do a fun one. Guess what a sanguivore eats? Some of you might have heard of it, some of you might not have. Blood! There! So they are not vampires, though. They are vampire bats. Usually vampire bats will attach themselves to cattle or something like that, and much like a mosquito, suck some of the blood out of them. But sanguivore eats only blood. Again, that will not be on the test. None of these will be on the test. You should know herbivore, carnivore, and omnivore, though. And you probably already do. Okay, let's move on to the third criteria for life. Senses and responds. Not as big as our eats, which has all this stuff in it. If we go to senses and responds, all we really get in the book is receptors. What is a receptor? Well, just like me, I'm sure you believe that a receptor, a robot receptionist at an office building, say Robocore. Well, guess what? We'd be wrong, although it'd be kind of cool, but receptors are not robot receptionists. Receptors are officially sensors, so they sense the environment around the organism. And not only does the organism sense the environment, but it also at that point responds to that. And we'll talk about things like response to light or gravity or touch and fun things like that. So we'll get into that more later in the book. Which brings us to our last criteria. All life forms reproduce. So they have kids. They pass on their genetic information. If they didn't do that, hopefully they're immortal, so they're always around. Otherwise, they just disappear and they become what we call extinct. But there are some crosses that result in sterile children, in which case they can't reproduce. And you say, what? Oh, like if you take a horse and a mule and you cross them, the resulting, or a horse and a donkey, and they cross them, the resulting mule you get is sterile. It cannot father or have children. So is it alive? It's got DNA, it eats, it senses and responds to its environment, but it can't reproduce, so it must be not alive, right? Well, the tricky part here is it still reproduces, but internally, all its cells reproduce, they replace each other. So you do not have to actually have children in order to be alive. Your cells reproduce, and if you never have children, that doesn't mean you never live. So, okay, there are two major what do we want categories we talk about in reproduction, and we'll get into these a little more in detail as well. That is asexual versus sexual reproduction. What's the difference between asexual and sexual reproduction? Well, here it is in the simplest term. In asexual reproduction, there is one and only one parent. In sexual reproduction, there are two parents. Primary difference we'll get there once we get into it is asexual parents are effectively clones of themselves, so their prodigy will be genetically identical to the parent. Sexual reproduction takes genetic material from both parents and combines them so that the resulting prodigy is a mixture, not genetically identical to either one. This has some great advantages we'll read about as we go along. An interesting thing about asexual, if humans reproduced asexually, probably the way we would do it is a little thing called budding, in which case you could say, hey, you want to see my baby? Here it is, growing off the side of me. It's almost ready to come out. So, so be a little creepy, but that baby would be genetically identical to the parent. So that's why you have some traits that are similar to your father, some traits that are similar to your mother, and then there's some traits that you have that perhaps are kind of buried between the two of them and just came out. But we'll talk more about that, especially when we get into genetics. That walks through the 4 criteria of life. If you have any questions, as usual, feel free to email me at mrc@mrcscience.com. Thank you.